Hello and welcome. Tonight, our journey takes us back to a time of chaos, an age of broken oaths, warring states, and profound uncertainty. We're diving into what life was really like during the spring and autumn period of ancient China. Forget the images of serene temples and wise sages. The truth is, it was a brutal, unsettling time, and you probably wouldn't have lasted a single day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. And don't forget to subscribe to Asia Times Discovered for more videos. Congratulations, you've just woken up. The year is approximately 700 BC. You're not a peasant, thankfully. You're a minor nobleman, a member of the gentry in the state of Lu. This is your ancestral home, a walled city of pounded earth and timber, surrounded by fields of millet and wheat. You are, by any measure, one of the privileged few, and your first thought upon waking is anxiety. A deep, quiet, boring anxiety that sits in your stomach like a cold stone. It's not the fear of a barbarian invasion, not the terror of a natural disaster. It's something far more mundane and, in many ways, far more terrifying. It's the anxiety of uncertainty. The world, as you know it, is crumbling, not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding decay. You're 30 years old. You should be in the prime of your life, secure in your position. But you're not, because the rules don't work anymore. Let's start with your home. You're a noble, but your house is dark. There's no glass in the latticed windows, just oiled paper or thin-spun silk that rattles in the wind, letting in a dim grey light. The air is cold. The only heat comes from bronze braziers filled with glowing charcoal, and they fill the room with a constant, acrid, eye-watering smoke that clings to your heavy robes. You've been breathing it your whole life, and you have a cough that will never ever go away. You get dressed. Your clothing isn't the soft, flowing silk you see in movies. It's rougher, a heavy-spun hemp or perhaps a stiff local silk, worn in multiple layers for warmth. It's a complicated layered robe called a shenyi, and the rules for how you tie the sash, what colour it is, what small jade ornaments you hang from it, they are everything. The Zhou dynasty, the one that is supposedly in charge, established a complete dress system, a visual language where clothing represents your virtue, your rank, your place in the cosmos. The Book of Rites has strict instructions for all of it. And here is the first source of your anxiety, with sickening certainty that the rules are being broken. Just last week you attended a ceremony at the court of your local duke, the Duke of Lu, and you saw something dreadful. You saw the head of the Jisun clan, one of the 3 Huan families who are technically subjects of the duke, using a full-on royal dance troupe, 8 rows of 8 dancers, a ritual reserved only for the Son of Heaven, the Zhou King himself. It was a flagrant, public, arrogant violation of Ali, of ritual propriety. And what happened? Nothing. The Duke said nothing. No one struck the man down. Everyone just watched and pretended it was normal. This is the world you live in. A world where the symbols of power are stolen by upstarts, and the true rulers are too weak to stop them. The Zhou dynasty, the central authority, is a joke. For centuries their power was based on the mandate of heaven, the Qianming. The idea was simple. Heaven gave a virtuous family the right to rule. If they became corrupt, heaven would show its displeasure with floods, famines, or earthquakes, and the mandate would pass to a new, more virtuous family. This concept, created for propaganda, held the world together. But in 771 BC, just a couple of generations before you were born, this system collapsed. Barbarian tribes and rebellious vassals attacked the Zhou capital. They killed the king, King Yu. The royal house fled, establishing a new, weaker capital in the east. This was the start of your Eastern Zhou period, the Spring and Autumn era. But the mandate was broken. The Zhou king is now just a puppet, a son of heaven in name only. He has no real army. He has no real authority. He is a ritualistic figurehead, a diplomatic pawn. The real power is fragmented. It's been seized by the vassals, the regional lords, the dukes of the 100+ states that make up China. Your state of Lu is one. The powerful state of Qi is to your north, the state of Chu is to your south, and even here, in your own state of Lu, the duke is a puppet. The real power belongs to three families, the Jisun, the Mengsun, and the Shusun. They are the ones who really collect the taxes, command the armies, and make the rules. So when you, a minor Shi noble, go to court, who do you bow to? Do you show loyalty to the duke, your rightful, heaven-appointed ruler? Or do you bow lower to the head of the Jizan clan, the man who actually controls your salary, and could have your family exiled? If you choose the duke, the Jisun clan marks you as an enemy. If you choose the Jisun clan, you are participating in the collapse of the very lie, the ritual order, that gives you your own noble status. This is not a boring problem. This is a daily, terrifying, existential tightrope. Every social interaction is a political test. Every ritual is a potential trap. You feel bitter and distressed about this social chaos, this world devoid of ritual and music. Now let's talk about your job. As a Shi, you are the lowest rung of the aristocracy, the bureaucrat warrior class. In the good old days of the Western Zhou, your position was hereditary and clear. You would serve the duke, perhaps as a record keeper, a ritual master, or an officer in his chariot guard. Today your job is to serve, well, whoever is in charge. Probably one of the three families. You might be a dafu, a baron or minister, in their private parallel government. You spend your days managing records on strips of bamboo, overseeing grain collection, or perhaps planning a war. War is constant, not the grand, world-changing wars of history, but 100 petty, inconclusive conflicts. The 7 major states are always feuding, always trying to absorb their smaller neighbours. Your own state of Lu is in a constant, precarious rivalry with the powerful state of Qi. And the warfare itself, it's a terrifying, clumsy, and deeply boring affair. The primary weapon is the war chariot. This isn't a sleek, fast vehicle. It's a heavy 2-wheeled wooden cart pulled by 2 or 4 horses. On it, there are 3 men, a driver in the middle, an archer on the left, and a spearman on the right. In the old days, this was a nobleman's game, governed by rules of chivalry. You were supposed to wait for your opponent to be ready. You didn't attack the weak. Those days are gone. Now warfare is becoming more ruthless. The state of Qin, far to the west, is already known for being ruthless and ignoring etiquette. They are influenced by a new, terrifying philosophy called legalism, which says the only thing that matters is state power. They will execute thousands of prisoners just to gain an advantage, and this brutal philosophy is spreading, so you are called to war. You put on your armour. It's not steel, it's lacquered leather, dozens of small, stiff pieces sewn together with silk cords. It's heavy, it's hot, and it doesn't offer much protection against a well-placed bronze-tipped arrow. You get in your chariot, and you rumble onto a dusty plain to fight the army of Qi. The battle is a chaotic, bouncing, screaming mass of tangled chariots, struggling horses, and confused infantry. And for what? Because the Duke of Qi insulted your duke? Or more likely, because the Mengsun clan wants to seize a small border town and its grain tax. You're risking your life, not for the Son of Heaven, not for the good of the world, but for a boring local tax dispute. 36 monarchs will be assassinated in this era. 52 states will be completely destroyed. You live with the boring statistical probability that yours could be next. This is the central anxiety of your life. The leader rituals are broken. The Fengjian system of hereditary ranks and loyalty is collapsing. The king is powerless. Your duke is a puppet. Your society is in total disarray. And in the streets, in the courts, new voices are rising. Itinerant scholars and thinkers, part of what will one day be called the 100 schools of thought, are walking from state to state, offering their own solutions. The Mohists preach universal love and pacifism. The legalists preach absolute power and harsh law. The Taoists whisper that you should just withdraw from it all, stop trying, and live in harmony with nature. It's an age of chaos, but also an age of ideas. The old world is dead, but the new one has not yet been born. This is the world you live in. You're a minor noble in the state of Lu, a state known for its ancient connection to the Zhou founders, a state that should be the bastion of old world ritual and order. And you are watching it all fall apart, one stolen dance, one broken oath, one petty war at a time. You are privileged, but you have no security. You're educated, but you have no answers. You're a shy, a gentleman, but you are living in an ungentlemanly world. Life is a boring, constant, low-level dread. And for the vast majority of people, the ones who feed you, clothe you, and die in your boring wars, life is even more precarious. Let's imagine, for a moment, you weren't a noble. You are privileged, but you have no security. You're educated, but you have no answers. You are a shah, a gentleman, living in an ungentlemanly world. Life is a boring, constant low-level dread. And for the vast majority of people, the ones who feed you, clothe you, and die in your boring wars, life is even more precarious. Let's imagine for a moment you weren't a noble. Congratulations, you've just woken up. It's the same year, 700 BC. But you're not a shy. You're a shumin, a commoner, a peasant farmer. And your first thought upon waking is not anxiety, it's exhaustion. A bone-deep weariness that has settled into your muscles from a lifetime of labour. You don't have a bed. You, your entire family, your parents, your wife, your children, all sleep together on a raised pounded earth platform called a kang, perhaps covered with a woven straw mat. Your home is a single small square room made of pounded earth or rough wattle and daub walls. It has no windows, only a single low doorway covered by a hanging mat. The roof is thatched, and it leaks. When it rains, rivulets of mud trickle down the inside walls. The air is thick. The room is filled with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale millet, and the acrid smoke from a central fire pit that has no chimney, only a small hole in the roof. Your eyes are perpetually red and sore from a lifetime of breathing it in. You blink awake not to a bell, but to the faint grey light filtering through the doorway. It's time to work. It is always time to work. You pull on your clothes, which consist of a single, coarse, hip-length tunic made of undyed hemp. It's rough, it's scratchy, and it's the only one you own. In the bitter cold of winter, you might add a layer of crude padding made from bundled reeds or straw. You have no shoes, only rough sandals woven from straw if you're lucky. Most of the time, you work barefoot. Your breakfast? Dream on. You don't eat a morning meal. You will work for several hours first, your stomach gnawing at your spine. Your first meal of the day, and perhaps your only one, will be in the fields. It will be a thick, gritty porridge of millet, boiled in a clay pot, perhaps with a few foraged wild greens or beans thrown in if you are fortunate. Meat is not something you ever think about. That is for the Lord for sacrifices. You step outside your hut. Your village is a small cluster of these same earth-coloured hovels, huddled together for protection. You walk to the fields which you do not own. You, your family, your entire village, you are all possessions of the local lord, the very Shi or Dafu nobleman we just imagined. You are bound to this land. You cannot leave. You are, in essence, a serf. Your tools are waiting for you. They are not the sharp, efficient iron tools that are just beginning to appear. Those are rare, expensive, and mostly reserved for weapons. Your tools are boring. They are what your ancestors have used for 1,000 years. A digging stick hardened in the fire, a heavy stone hoe, a sickle, perhaps with a bronze blade if your lord's estate is wealthy, for harvesting the millet. Your entire life is a cycle of back-breaking, repetitive, boring labour. You plant the millet one seed at a time, bent over in the mud. You weed the fields under the blazing sun. You guide the wooden plough, if your village is lucky enough to share one, pulled by a single exhausted ox. You haul water in wooden buckets from the river. You repair the dikes and irrigation ditches that water your lord's land. You harvest, cutting the stalks one by one, your hands raw and blistered. And what do you get for this? A tiny fraction. The vast majority of the grain you just harvested, the grain your family's life depends on, is loaded onto carts and taken to the lord's granary. It is your tax. It is the price you pay for what, exactly? Protection. This is the greatest, most boring cruelty of your life. The protection is a lie. The Shi nobleman in his drafty house is anxious about which warlord to bow to. You are terrified of all of them. When the state of Lu fights the state of Qi, who is on the front lines? You are. Your lord and his fellow nobles rumble behind on their fancy chariots, but you are the Zhu, the conscript infantry, the expendable ones. You are given a long wooden spear with a small bronze tip, maybe a small wicker shield, and you are told to march. You have no training. You have no armor. You're just a wall of bodies, meant to absorb the enemy's charge, to die while the nobles on their chariots conduct their chivalrous warfare. And if you survive the battle, you return to your village only to find it in ruins, because while you were gone, a rival army, or perhaps even a friendly army from a neighbouring town, swept through. They took the grain you had left, they stole your only ox, they set fire to the thatched roofs of your village. This is your life, a boring, endless cycle of being squeezed. You are squeezed by your lord for taxes and labour. You are squeezed by nature. A drought or a flood means you and your children will starve, while the lord survives on the grain in his storehouse. And you are squeezed by war. The Shi and Dafu are fighting for power, for face, for the right to perform a ritual with 8 rows of dancers. You're the one who pays for it, with your grain, with your labour, and with your blood. You have no rights. If a nobleman's chariot runs you down in the road, it is your fault for being in the way. You have no voice. The Li, the great rituals the nobles are so worried about, don't apply to you. You're Shumin, common folk, literally the grass and the trees, existing only to be cut down. Your life, your suffering, it is simply the natural state of the world. And hygiene? Let's not. You wash, when you can, in the same muddy river you get your drinking water from. Sickness is constant. A cut from your sickle, festering in the field's mud, is a death sentence. A fever, a cough, a boring case of dysentery from the water. These are visitations from angry ancestors or local spirits. There is no medicine for you. You live, you work, you suffer, and you die, probably before you're 35. This is the grinding, boring, and utterly hopeless reality for 9 out of 10 people in this glorious spring and autumn period. This constant, grinding reality of warfare and poverty, for both the anxious noble and the exhausted peasant, created more than just physical suffering. It created a boring but profound crisis of the mind. This is the grinding, boring, and utterly hopeless reality for 9 out of 10 people in this glorious spring and autumn period. This constant, grinding reality of warfare and poverty for both the anxious noble and the exhausted peasant created more than just physical suffering. It created a boring, invisible, and profound crisis of the mind. It was a crisis of belief. For centuries the world made sense, or at least it was supposed to make sense. The Zhou dynasty, the one that was now a powerless puppet, had built its entire legitimacy on a single powerful, boring idea, the Chen Ming, or the mandate of heaven. The concept was simple, and it was brilliant propaganda. Heaven, a supreme, non-personal cosmic force, observed the rulers of humankind. It would grant the mandate, the divine right to rule, to a virtuous and just family. This family would then establish a dynasty. As long as the dynasty ruled with virtue, cared for the people, and performed the correct rituals, heaven would bless the land with peace and prosperity. But, the Zhou rulers warned, this mandate was not permanent. It was precarious. If a dynasty became corrupt, if the kings grew decadent, selfish, and cruel, heaven would show its displeasure. There would be floods, there would be earthquakes, there would be famines. These were not random, boring disasters. They were cosmic warnings. And if the rulers did not heed these warnings, heaven would withdraw its mandate and bestow it upon a new, more virtuous family, who would then be justified in rising up and overthrowing the old corrupt dynasty. This idea held the world together. It was the why. Why is the king in charge? The mandate of heaven. Why must you, the noble, be loyal to the king? The mandate of heaven. Why must you, the peasant, pay your taxes and obey your lord? Because he is part of a system ordained by heaven itself. It was the ultimate justification for the entire social and political order, and in 771 BC, that justification shattered. When the barbarian tribes and rebellious vassals stormed the capital and killed the Zhou king, King Yu, they did more than just win a battle. They broke the mandate. The royal house fled east, weak and humiliated, becoming the Eastern Zhou. The Son of Heaven was now a king with no army, no territory, and no real power. And heaven was silent. There was no great intervention. The world just kept going. The old corrupt rulers were not all swept away. The barbarian tribes were not punished by lightning. The mandate, it seemed, was not passed to a new, singular, virtuous ruler. It was just broken. This is the boring but terrifying crisis you live in. The fundamental why of your world is gone. The great rituals, the Elseth that the nobles performed. What was the point of them anymore? They were meant to maintain harmony between heaven and earth, but heaven was no longer participating. The Chinese scholars of this era had a specific, boring phrase for this. They called it Li Beng Yue Huai. The rites are shattered and the music is destroyed. It meant in short that society was in total disarray. The fundamental principles were gone. The great historian Sima Qian, looking back on this era, wrote a boring but horrifying summary. During this period, 36 monarchs were assassinated, 52 states were utterly destroyed, and countless other nobles were forced to flee, their states and families perishing. This is your world, a world of constant low-level warfare, where loyalty is a temporary convenience and assassination is a viable political tool. This chaos, this boring moral void, is what triggered the single most explosive intellectual period in human history. It's known as the contention of 100 schools of thought. Because the old answers had failed, everyone had a new one. Itinerant scholars, thinkers, and philosophers began to walk from state to state, from one duke's court to the next, offering their services as advisors. They were trying to answer one boring question. In a world of chaos, how do we create order? You, as that minor noble in Lu, would see them pass through your city. They would gather small groups of students debating in the marketplaces and the courts. One group, the legalists, had a simple, terrifying answer. Their thinkers, like Shang Yang, argued that human nature was incorrigibly selfish and evil. People were not naturally good. Therefore, morality, virtue, and rituals were all a waste of time. The only way to create order was through harsh rules and laws, and the absolute terrifying threat of punishment. The state was everything. The individual was nothing. They advised rulers to force people to marry early, to have many children, to meet production quotas, and to punish the smallest failure with amputation or death. Another group, the Taoists, had the complete opposite answer. Their founder, the boring and mysterious Laozi, wrote a short book of cryptic verses. His message: the chaos wasn't the problem. Trying to fix the chaos was the problem. Society itself, with all its boring rules, laws, and rituals, was the source of suffering. Human beings were trying too hard. The only solution, he whispered, was to wu wei, to do nothing, to withdraw from the boring affairs of the world, to stop striving for power or fame, and to live simply in harmony with the Tao, the natural, effortless way of the universe. Then came the Mohists, following their founder Mozi. His answer was also radical. He looked at the chaos and said the problem was all the boring partiality, the loyalty to family, the loyalty to your lord, the loyalty to your state. All this loyalty just caused division and war. His solution? Jian Ai, or impartial care. You must love everyone equally as heaven does. Love a stranger's father as much as your own. He condemned the boring rituals and music of the nobles as extravagant and wasteful. He was a pacifist, advocating only for defensive warfare. There were others. The school of names, who were boring logicians obsessed with language. The school of naturalists, who focused on the 5 elements. The school of the military, whose masters like Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War, not a book of philosophy, but a boring, practical manual on how to win these new ruthless wars. This was the world you lived in. A world of broken rituals, assassinated kings, and constant, boring warfare. A world where the old gods were silent and 100 new philosophers were all shouting for your attention. Legalists offering order through terror, Taoists offering peace through withdrawal, Mohists offering harmony through universal love. Into this void of belief, this boring but terrifying chaos of collapsing systems and competing ideas, one more man would step forward. He wasn't a legalist. He wasn't a Taoist. He wasn't a Mohist. He was a man from your very own state of Lu. A man who, like you, was a minor Shi. A gentleman from an impoverished noble family. A man who looked at this chaos, this Lebeng Yue Huai, and felt bitter and distressed. He didn't want to invent a new system. He didn't want to withdraw from the world. He didn't want to rule by terror. He wanted, in a boring and deeply radical way, to go back. He believed the answer was to restore the old rituals, the music, and the hierarchy of the golden age of the Zhou dynasty. He believed the answer lay in the very Li that everyone else was abandoning, but he wanted to give it a new heart, a new meaning. Into this world of chaos, a world where the old rules were broken and the heavens seemed silent, a single man was born. He wasn't a king or a general. He was, at first, just a boy named Kong Qiu. Into this world of chaos, this Li Beng Yue Huai, this age of broken rituals and warring states, a single man would step forward. He wasn't a legalist, a Taoist, or a Mohist. He was a man from the state of Lu, a boring traditionalist who believed the answer to the chaos was not to invent something new, but to properly understand something old. A man who would die thinking he was a failure, yet whose ideas would come to define one of the world's great civilizations. He wasn't born Confucius. That's a Latin name given to him by European missionaries 1700 years later. He was born, it is believed, in the year 551 BC, in a small town in the state of Lu, near the modern city of Qufu. His name was Kong Qiu. His family, the Kong clan, was part of the Shi, the minor nobility, the same class we imagined earlier. And like many Shi families of the time, they had a boring but impressive lineage, and not much else. Tradition holds that his ancestors were high-ranking aristocrats, perhaps even part of the royal house of the neighbouring state of Song, who had fled to Lu generations earlier after losing their political standing and their wealth. So Kong Qiu was born an aristocrat, but only on paper. His birth itself is shrouded in boring but poignant family drama. His father was a man named Shuliang He, a respected and locally famous military officer of Lu. Shuliang He was known for his incredible strength. One story tells of him holding a heavy falling portcullis, a city gate, open with his bare hands, allowing his trapped soldiers to escape. But he was an old man by the time of Confucius's birth, perhaps in his 60s or even 70s, and he had a boring succession problem. His first wife had borne him 9 children. All of them were daughters. In a patriarchal society obsessed with continuing the family line and the ancestral rights, this was a disaster. His concubine had finally given him a son, but this son, named Meng Pi, was frail and described as having a foot malady, possibly a clubfoot, and was thus considered unfit to be the heir. Desperate for a healthy son, the elderly Shuliang He approached a neighbouring family, the Yan. He proposed a marriage to one of their daughters. The father Yan presented the request to his 3 girls. The 2 eldest were silent, but the youngest, a teenager named Yan Zhengzai, stepped forward and said she would obey her father's wishes. She became Shuliang He's wife, or perhaps a concubine, and soon after she gave birth to Kong Qiu. This is the family our philosopher was born into, a celebrated but aging father, a very young mother, 9 half-sisters, and a disabled half-brother. And then the boring but universal tragedy of life struck. When Kong Qiu was only 3 years old, his father, Shuliang He, died. Suddenly, the family's already precarious social and financial situation collapsed. It's likely Shuliang He's first wife, the one with the 9 daughters, cast out the young Yan Zhengzai and her infant son. Kong Qiu and his mother were left alone, and in a word, poor. They were impoverished. They were Shi by name, but commoners in reality. This boring fact of his childhood poverty is the single most important key to understanding the man he would become. He was not a prince like the Buddha, insulated from suffering. He was not a wealthy aristocrat like Plato, with endless leisure to ponder the abstract. He was a poor boy who knew what it was to be hungry, to be overlooked, and to live on the margins of a society obsessed with rank. His mother, Yan Zhengzai, raised him in the city of Qufu. She was, by all accounts, a strong and resourceful woman, and she was determined that her son would receive an education. Despite their poverty, Kong Qiu was not sent to the fields. He was sent to one of the schools for commoners, where he studied what was known as the 6 arts: rites, lie, music, archery, charioteering, calligraphy, and mathematics. This was a boring, practical education for a young Shi who needed to find work. Archery and charioteering were for military service. Calligraphy and mathematics were for government bureaucracy. But there was one subject that Kong Qiu became obsessed with: Li, the rites. This is the great, boring paradox of his youth. In an age where everyone else saw the rituals as crumbling, empty, and useless, this poor boy, who had no real claim to the high-ranking rituals, fell in love with them. He was, in a word, a traditionalist, an antiquarian. Even as a child, he was said to play by boringly setting up ritual vessels and practicing the gestures and bows of ancient ceremonies. Why? Perhaps because for a boy with no status, no wealth, and no powerful father, the rules were the only thing that made sense. In a world of chaos, the LA represented a boring, stable, and just system where everyone had a proper place, and where virtue, not brute force, was what mattered. The rituals to him weren't empty. They were the very language of a harmonious society, a language that everyone had forgotten how to speak. His poverty meant he had to work. He couldn't just be a scholar. The Analects, the Book of His Sayings, records him saying, "When I was young, I was of humble status. That is why I am proficient in many menial things." When his mother died, when he was still a young man, some sources say 17, others 23, he was left truly alone. He is said to have mourned her for 3 years, following the ancient formal ritual that most of his contemporaries would have found boring and impractical. At age 19, he married a woman named Kigwan. A year later, they had a son, Kong Li. He now had a family to support, so he took the kind of boring jobs that were available to an educated but poor nobleman. He found employment with the powerful Jisun clan, the very family that was undermining the Duke of Lu. This is a boring but crucial detail. He wasn't a rebel, he was a pragmatist. He needed to eat. His first job? A keeper of granaries. Imagine that. The man who would shape Asian civilization for 2 millennia. His first job was as a boring accountant in a silo. He sat with bamboo slips counting sacks of millet and rice as they came in from the fields. He made sure the stores were dry, that the rats weren't eating the profits, that the ledgers balanced. The Mencius, another classical text, says of this job that he just kept his accounts straight. That was it. His next job was just as boring. He was put in charge of the livestock fields. He was a supervisor of sheep and cattle. His entire focus was, as the Mencius says, that the oxen and sheep should be strong and fat. This is not the life of a prophet. This is the life of a hard-working, boring civil servant. He was a bookkeeper, a ranch manager. But these boring jobs were his true education. In the granary, he saw the boring economics of the state, the burden of taxes, the reality of a good or bad harvest. In the fields, he saw the boring realities of labour and the natural world, and all the while he studied. He was, as his contemporaries noted, an indefatigable learner. He sought out anyone who knew the old songs, the old histories, the old rituals. He became known in Lu for his expertise in the very boring ceremonial forms that others were forgetting. When he was 27, he supposedly met a visitor from another state, and eagerly asked him to explain the boring ancient practice of naming government offices after birds. This was the man, not a mystic, not a prince. He was Kong Q, a poor fatherless Shai, a gentleman obsessed with lost rules, a boring accountant who believed, with his whole heart, that the answer to the chaos of his time was not a new law, not a new god, and not a new war, but the correct and sincere performance of a ceremony. He believed that if he could just teach people, especially rulers, how to be good again, how to be good fathers, good sons, good ministers, and good rulers, then the world would heal itself. He just needed someone to listen. This was the man, not a mystic, not a prince. He was Kong Q, a poor, fatherless Shi, a gentleman obsessed with lost rules, a boring accountant who believed with his whole heart that the answer to the chaos of his time was not a new law, not a new god, and not a new war, but the correct and sincere performance of a ceremony. He believed that if he could just teach people, especially rulers, how to be good again, how to be good fathers, good sons, good ministers, and good rulers, then the world would heal itself. He just needed someone to listen. And for a brief, shining, boring moment, it seemed like someone finally would. Through his boring but competent work as a granary keeper and livestock manager for the powerful Ji family, and through his growing niche reputation as an expert on ancient rituals, Kong Qiu finally got a real government job. It wasn't much at first. He was appointed governor of a small town in Lu, but he applied his principles. He governed with fairness, promoted moral conduct, and presumably kept excellent records. His success was noted. He rose. He was appointed Minister of Works, a boring but important job overseeing public construction projects. And then he reached the peak of his career. Around the year 501 BC, when he was about 50 years old, Kongqiu was made the Minister of Crime for the state of Lu. This was it. This was his chance. Not just to teach, but to do, to put his theories into practice. And the historical records, though scanty, suggest he was incredibly effective. We are told that as Minister of Crime, he was so fair and his moral influence so great that crime virtually disappeared. Merchants stopped haggling with dishonest prices. People stopped picking up lost items in the street, instead returning them to their owners. He was, in short, a boring administrative success. He was also a skilled diplomat. In one famous incident, he accompanied his ruler, Duke Ding of Lu, to a meeting with the Duke of the powerful neighbouring state of Qi. Kongqiu, ever the ritual expert, sensed a trap. He insisted that the meeting be accompanied by a full military guard, a boring precaution his duke might have overlooked. He was right. The Qi officials had planned an ambush, intending to seize Duke Ding. Because of Kongqiu's boring planning, the ambush failed, and he even managed to use the diplomatic incident to shame the Duke of Qi into returning lands they had previously stolen from Lu. He was a success. His reforms were working. The state of Lu was becoming more orderly, more just. And this was the problem. The real power in Lu, as we know, didn't belong to the Duke. It belonged to the three Huan families, especially the Ji clan. And they liked the chaos. The chaos. The weak Duke. The broken rituals. That was how they maintained their power. Kongqiu, with his boring insistence on morality, his rigid adherence to ancient ritual, and his radical belief that the Duke should actually be the ruler, was a direct threat to their entire system. He even tried to have the families dismantle the illegal fortifications of their private cities, a plan that backfired spectacularly. The powerful families knew they couldn't just get rid of him. He was too popular with the people and for now had the Duke's ear. So they resorted to a boring but timeless tactic: distraction. The story, recorded by the historian Sima Qian, is almost comical in its pettiness. The rival state of Qi, seeing Lu grow strong under Kongqiu's boring moral influence, grew worried. So they devised a plan. They didn't send an army, they sent a gift of 80 beautiful dancing girls and 120 magnificent horses. The head of the Ji clan, the real power in Lu, gleefully accepted this gift. He and the Duke spent their days watching the girls dance, admiring the new horses. They became so enthralled with these new, boring amusements that they completely neglected their duties. For 3 days, the court was paralysed. No one showed up to the official state sacrifices. The boring work of government, the moral reforms Kongqiu was trying to build, ground to a halt. Kongqiu watched all of this. He saw his ruler, the man he was trying to mould into a sage king, completely lose himself in the most superficial of pleasures. He saw the powerful Ji clan openly flaunt this decadence, this profound breach of Li ritual. He realised with the cold, boring certainty of a failed accountant that his project was doomed. The foundations were rotten. The men in power were not interested in virtue. They were interested in horses and dancers. And so, Kongqiu, the Minister of Crime, the most successful administrator in the state of Lu, quit. He resigned his post. He packed his few belongings. He gathered his small, loyal group of students, and at the age of 56 he left the state of Lu. He became, in essence, an unemployed, self-exiled philosopher. Thus began the great, boring central act of his life. It was a failure, a long 13-year failure. It was his long walk, his wanderings. His plan was simple. He would walk from state to state, from one petty court to the next, and try to find a single ruler, a duke, a prince, anyone who would be wise enough to hire him and implement his boring ideas about virtue, ritual, and good government. This was not a glorious journey. It was a boring, desperate job search. His first and most frequent stop was the state of Wei. The Duke of Wei was intrigued by this famous scholar from Lu. He gave him a stipend, the same boring salary he had earned in Lu, but the Duke was not a philosopher king. He was a weak-willed man, far more interested in his glamorous and famously scandalous consort, Nanzi. Kongqiu, in a boring but controversial move, actually agreed to an audience with Nanzi, hoping perhaps to influence the court through her. His disciples were horrified. Why was their master, the paragon of virtue, meeting with this improper woman? Kongqiu had to swear an oath to them If I have done anything improper, may heaven reject me, may heaven reject me. He could see quickly that the Duke of Wei was not serious. In one famous, boring anecdote, Conque was in a carriage, riding in procession with the Duke. But the Duke had his consort, Nanzi, ride in the main carriage, forcing Conque to follow behind in a second one. It was a public humiliation, a clear statement of priorities. The Duke was parading his consort, not his philosopher. Conque sighed. "I have never seen anyone," he said, "who loves virtue as much as he loves physical beauty." He left Wei. He and his disciples walked on. They went to the state of Song, the ancestral homeland of his family. But here he was not welcomed as a long-lost son. He was seen as a threat. While he was teaching his students under a large tree, a high-ranking minister of Song, Huan Tui, wanted him gone. He sent men to pull down the tree, a clear threat of violence, intending to disperse the group and perhaps kill Conque. Conque and his disciples were forced to flee in disguise, boring fugitives running for their lives. They walked on. They came to the small states of Chen and Kai. And here they met not with political intrigue, but with boring, simple starvation. The rulers of these states, caught in a war with the larger state of Chu, were suspicious of this wandering philosopher and his band of followers. They were cut off. Their supplies ran out. For 7 days, the stories say, Conque and his disciples had no food. They were starving, weak, their robes in tatters. This was the ultimate boring test of their philosophy. His disciples began to waver. Zilu, his most loyal but hot-headed student, came to him, angry. "Master Junzi, a gentleman, also endure poverty?" he demanded. Conque's answer was the essence of his boring and unshakable philosophy. "Of course," he said calmly. "The gentleman remains firm in poverty. The small man, when he is in poverty, simply overflows." He wasn't promising them riches. He wasn't promising them power. He was simply saying that their boring moral character was the only thing that mattered, whether they were starving in a ditch or advising a king. He took out his chin, his stringed instrument, and he began to play and sing, his voice weak from hunger, but his commitment to ritual and music unbroken. This was his life for 13 boring, grueling years. He was Conque, the wandering, unemployed philosopher. He was the man with all the answers, and nobody in power wanted to hear them. They were too boring. They were too hard. They didn't offer quick victories, only the long, boring work of moral cultivation. Rulers wanted military strategy from men like Sun Tzu. They wanted political tricks from the legalists. They did not want to be told to be virtuous. This long, boring failure was the crucible that forged Confucianism. It stripped away his political ambition and left him with only one role, the only one that truly mattered. After 13 years of failure, an old man, now 68, he was finally invited back home to the state of Lu, not as a minister, not as an advisor, but as a boring, respected elder, a harmless teacher. His political career was, by every possible measure, a complete and total failure. But his real work, the work that would outlast every duke and king who had rejected him, was just beginning. This was his life for 13 boring, grueling years. He was Conque, the wandering, unemployed philosopher. He was the man with all the answers, and nobody in power wanted to hear them. They were too boring. They were too hard. They didn't offer quick victories, only the long, boring work of moral cultivation. Rulers wanted military strategy from men like Sun Tzu. They wanted political tricks from the legalists. They did not want to be told to be virtuous. This long Desso's boring failure was the crucible that forged Confucianism. It stripped away his political ambition and left him with only one role, the only one that truly mattered. After 13 years of failure, an old man, now 68, he was finally invited back home to the state of Lu, not as a minister, not as an advisor, but as a boring, respected elder, a harmless teacher. The powerful families like the Ji clan were no longer threatened by him. He was just an old man, his political career by every possible measure a complete and total failure. But his real work, the work that would outlast every duke and king who had rejected him, was just beginning. He returned to his hometown of Qufu, but not to a life of quiet retirement. He established a school. This in itself was a boring but revolutionary act. In his time, education was the exclusive right of the aristocracy. conducted by government officials. Kongqiu did something different. He established a private school, and he accepted students not based on their noble birth or their wealth, but on their desire to learn. This broke the monopoly of official education. He famously said, "In teaching there should be no distinction of classes. His only requirement for tuition, a boring symbolic bundle of dried meat." So they came. Not just the sons of nobles, but the sons of commoners, of merchants, of anyone who was earnest and bright. Tradition says he had over 3,000 students who passed through his school, with a core group of about 72 who truly mastered his teachings. His teaching style was not what we would recognize. It was not a boring lecture, it was a boring conversation. He would sit with his students, perhaps under a tree, and he would talk. He would ask questions, he would debate. He would present a boring problem of etiquette. If a ruler does this, what is the proper response? He would drill them in the boring fundamentals of the 6 arts he had learned as a boy: archery, charioteering, calligraphy, mathematics, music, and above all, the rites. He saw these not as mere skills, but as tools for moral cultivation. Archery wasn't about hitting the target. It was about focus, stability, and proper form. Music, especially the ancient, boring Shao music, wasn't for entertainment. It was the sound of a harmonious, well-ordered soul. He believed that joy but no immodest thoughts, sorrow but no self-injury, was the ideal state, and music was the way to achieve it. His disciples were a varied bunch. There was Yan Hui, his favourite, a brilliant and pure-hearted student from a poor family, who lived in a boring hovel and never complained, embodying the virtue Kongqiu admired. There was Zilu, the hot-headed, impetuous former brawler, loyal but always needing to be calmed down. There was Cai Yu, a student good with words, who once boringly asked if a benevolent man should jump in a well to save someone, to which Kongqiu dryly replied that a gentleman can be tricked, but not fooled into doing something stupid. He was by all accounts a tough and demanding teacher. He famously said of a student he found sleeping during the day, "Rotten wood cannot be carved." But he was also deeply human, weeping openly when his favourite student Yan Hui died young. But his teaching was only half of his final, boring project. His other great work was that of an editor, an archivist. Kongqiu was in love with the past. He believed the golden age of the early Zhou dynasty, centuries before, was a time of perfect harmony, when virtuous kings ruled and the Li were perfectly observed. His entire philosophy was based on returning to this boring old world order. But in his chaotic era, the texts from that period were being lost, corrupted, or ignored. So in his final years, this boring old man took it upon himself to save them. He became a one-man preservation society. This, perhaps, was his greatest gift to China, a boring act of scholarship that saved the core of a civilization. He supposedly compiled and edited the 5 classics. First, the Book of Odes, Shi Jing. Tradition says he gathered some 3,000 ancient poems, folk songs, and ritual hymns. He then boringly sifted through them all, selecting the 3 or 5 he believed were morally upright, harmonious, and useful for teaching virtue. He loved the odes, telling his son, "Unless you learn the odes, you won't be able to speak." Second, the Book of Documents, Shu Jing. This was a boring collection of decrees, speeches, and political records from the glorified sage kings of the past. He edited them, arranged them, and used them as a boring textbook for his students on how a virtuous government should work. Third, the Book of Rites, Li Ji. This was his passion. This was a vast, boring collection of thousands of rules for social conduct: how to greet someone, how to serve tea, how to dress for court, how to mourn your parents. To his contemporaries, this was fussy, boring, and outdated. To Kongqiu, it was the very language of a shared humanity, the practical, boring framework that taught people to be respectful and good. Fourth, the classic of music, Yue Jing. This text is now lost, but he believed music and ritual were inseparable partners in creating a harmonious soul. And finally, the Spring and Autumn Annals, Chunqiu. This was his most personal, boring work. It was, on the surface, the extremely boring official court chronicle of his own state of Lu, recording events from 722 to 481 BC. It was just a dry list of facts. In this year the Duke did this. In this year there was an eclipse. In this year so-and-so died. but later scholars believed Kong-Q had infused this boring text with a secret hidden meaning, that through his boring and subtle choice of words he was passing moral judgment. By calling a ruler duke, he was approving of him. By referring to him just by his name, he was condemning him. It was a boring but subversive way of writing a history of his time, a history where, in his view, everyone was failing to live up to the boring standards of the past. This was his life, a boring old man surrounded by loyal students, spending his days talking about virtue and editing dusty bamboo scrolls, preserving the past while the world outside his door tore itself apart. He suffered personal losses. His own son, Kongli, died. Then his beloved student Yan Hui died. Then his tough, loyal friend Zilu was killed in a political skirmish. The old man was heartbroken, the boring tragedies of life piling up. In 479 BC, at the age of 72 or 73, Kong-Q, the man we call Confucius, died. He died, by all accounts, believing he was a failure. He had not restored the Zhou dynasty. He had not convinced a single ruler to adopt his boring system of virtue. The wars were only getting worse, about to descend into the even more brutal Warring States period. He was just a boring teacher and editor from Lu, a minor historical footnote. But he left behind something more powerful than any army, law, or kingdom. He left behind his students. And those students, they had been boringly writing down everything he said. In 479 BC, Kong-Q, the man we call Confucius, died in his home state of Lu. He was in his early 70s. By all accounts, he died believing he was a complete failure. He had not stopped the chaos. The world was not returning to the virtuous, boring rituals of the Zhou dynasty. He had failed to convince a single ruler to implement his grand political project. The wars were only getting worse, about to descend into the even more brutal Warring States period. He was just a boring, respected old teacher, a minor footnote in the history of Lu destined to be forgotten. He was wrong. He had overlooked one crucial, boring detail. He had left behind his students, and those students for decades had been boringly writing down everything he said. This is the central, boring fact of Confucianism. Confucius himself wrote nothing. He was not an author, he was a teacher, he was a talker. He believed truth was found in dialogue, in the boring back and forth of questions and answers between a master and his disciples. He did not write a grand philosophical book. The book that we call the Analects is not a book, not really. The name Analects comes from a Greek word, analekta, which means a gathering, or a collection of fragments. The Chinese title is Lunyu, which translates even more boringly to discuss sayings or collected conversations. That's all it is. It's a scrapbook. It's a collection of notes. It was compiled by his disciples and their disciples in the decades after he died. It was likely not a single project, but a collective effort over 30 to 50 years, or perhaps even longer. Imagine his students, Yan Hui, Zilu, Zigong, gathering after the master's funeral, pooling their boring little notes. One student, according to tradition, would have kept individual records of conversations, perhaps on strips of bamboo or slips of wood. Another would have remembered a specific turn of phrase. They gathered them all together and jointly edited the resulting compilation. This is why the book is so boring, and so difficult to read on a first pass. If you open the Analects expecting a structured philosophical argument like you'd get from Plato, you will be deeply disappointed. There is no structure. The chapters are grouped by theme, but only vaguely. The sequence of sayings within those chapters is, for the most part, entirely random. A boring snippet about filial piety will be followed by a boring snippet about music, which will be followed by a boring complaint about a specific disciple, which will be followed by a profound statement on the way or the Tao. It's a collection of fragments. Some central themes are repeated over and over, sometimes in the same wording, sometimes with slight changes. This has led scholars to conclude it's not the work of one author, but a collective, layered, boring work of memory. And it's not just what Confucius said, it's also what he did. The Analects are filled with boring but intimate descriptions of the man himself, how he behaved. His disciples boringly recorded everything. We know, from the Analects, that he did not complain against heaven, nor did he blame man. We know that when he heard the ancient Shao music, for 3 months he did not notice the taste of meat. We know that he was respectful towards others and observant of the rites. The book is an anthology of brief passages, of his words, of his disciples' words, and of descriptions of his life. This boring, disorganized, scrapbook-like quality is precisely what makes it so powerful. It's not a cold, abstract theory, it's a human document. You feel like you are right there in the room, listening to the conversations. And this boring collection of fragments, compiled by students over decades, was almost lost to history. During the Qin dynasty, centuries later, the first emperor Qin Shi Huang, a brutal, efficient legalist, ordered a massive book burning in 213 BC. He wanted to destroy all the old philosophies, all the boring records of the past, and make history begin with him. Confucianism, with its boring respect for the past and its moral critiques of rulers, was a primary target. It's a miracle the Analects survived at all, likely hidden away by devoted scholars. When the Han Dynasty took over and revived the ancient texts, there wasn't just one Analects. There were 3 different versions in circulation: the Lu version, the Qi version, and the ancient texts version, supposedly found hidden in a wall. It was all a boring academic mess. Finally, a Han Dynasty scholar named Zhang Yu combined the Lu and Qi versions, creating the Marcus Zhang Analects, which is the 20-chapter version we know today. This boring text, this disorganized, randomly sequenced, multi-version scrapbook of a failed politician's sayings, compiled by his students 50 years after his death, would go on to become one of the most important books in human history. It became one of the 4 books that formed the core, boring curriculum for the Chinese civil service examination. For nearly 2,000 years, if you wanted a government job, if you wanted to be considered an educated, morally upright person, you had to know the Analects inside and out. These boring, scattered, simple conversations were not a grand philosophy. They were a practical guide, a set of boring rules for how to be a good person. This boring text, this disorganized, randomly sequenced scrapbook of a failed politician's sayings, compiled by his students 50 years after his death, would go on to become one of the most important books in human history. But what does it actually say? If you sit down to read the Analects, you're not going to find a grand, sweeping, boring metaphysical system. Confucius was not interested in the boring supernatural. His disciples would later say that the master rarely spoke of spiritual beings or the supernatural. When a student boringly asked him about how to serve the spirits and the dead, Confucius gave a famously boring and practical answer. "You're not yet able to serve people. How can you serve spirits?" the student asked about death. Confucius replied, "You do not yet understand life. How can you understand death?" His philosophy was not about the afterlife. It was not about gods or magic. It was about this world. It was about the boring, everyday, human-to-human interactions that make up a life. His entire system, the one that would shape China for 2,000 years, was not a boring theology. It was a boring practical guide, a set of rules for how to be a good person in a world that seemed to reward being a bad one. And it all rested on a few core, boring, interconnected ideas. The first and most important is the very centre of his thought. It's a single word. Ren. Ren. This word is almost impossible to translate. It's been called love, benevolence, humanity, goodness, humaneness. It is, in essence, the boring quality of being a perfectly good, moral and empathetic human being. It is the very root of a man's character. When his disciples asked him to define Ren, he gave different, boring, practical answers. To one, he said, it is to love people. To another, he gave his most famous boring formulation, the one that would echo through history. A student named Zagong asked, "Is there one word that can serve as a guide for one's entire life?" The master said, "Is it not reciprocity? What you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others." Think about that for a moment. It's the boring golden rule, but stated in the negative. It's not a grand command to do things. It's a boring, passive, and profoundly difficult command to refrain from doing things. It's a boring philosophy of restraint. Don't be cruel because you don't want cruelty. Don't be rude because you don't want rudeness. Don't be disloyal because you don't want betrayal. Ren is the boring internal psychological state of perfect empathy and self-control. It's a boring lifelong quest to self-cultivate. It's not a gift. It's not something you're born with. It's something you build day after day through boring, repetitive, conscious effort. This was his answer to the legalists who believed humans were incorrigibly selfish. Confucius disagreed. He was an optimist. He believed that all people had the potential for Ren, the seed of goodness within them. They just needed a system. They needed boring practice. Which brings us to the second equally important boring idea. Li. If Ren is the boring internal goal, the feeling of perfect virtue, then Li is the boring external action. The practice. Li is usually translated as rites or ritual propriety. And this was the idea that his contemporaries found so boring and outdated. When we hear ritual, we think of boring temple sacrifices, of priests chanting in elaborate robes. And for Confucius, that was part of it. He was obsessed with the ancient music and ceremonies of the Zhou dynasty, but for him, Li was so much more. It wasn't just boring formal ceremony, it was general day-to-day etiquette and social custom. It was all the boring rules of human interaction. Li is knowing the boring, correct way to greet someone. Li is the boring way you pour a cup of wine for a guest. Li is the boring way you hold yourself when you're speaking to your superior versus how you speak to your inferior. Li is knowing when to speak and when to be silent. Li is the boring, proper way to dress for a funeral versus a wedding. Li is boring good manners. This, to Confucius, was not boring, superficial fluff. This was the language of civilization. This was the grammar of Ren. He believed that these boring rituals were the language in which we communicate our shared humanity and respect for one another. When you perform the boring ritual of bowing to your father, you're not just boringly bobbing your head. You're performing respect. You're practicing your role as a son. And in that boring physical act, you're reinforcing the proper harmonious order of the world. He believed that these boring rituals grind our characters like pieces of jade. A piece of jade, when it comes from the earth, is rough, boring and ugly. It only becomes beautiful, smooth and lustrous after boring hours of grinding and polishing. Li, for Confucius, was the boring polishing tool for the human soul. When a student asked him to define Ren, to define perfect virtue, Confucius gave a boring, simple answer. Giving yourself over to ritual, Li, that is humanity, Ren. His answer to the chaos of his time, the Li Beng Yue Huai, rights shattered, music destroyed, was not to invent new laws or dream of a new world. His answer was to restore the Li, to deny self and return to propriety. But where do you start? How do you teach an entire society from the duke to the peasant to practice Ren and Li? Confucius had a boring, practical answer for that too. You start in the family. This is the third boring pillar of his thought, xiao, or filial piety. This, for Confucius, was the boring route, the training ground for all other virtues. His logic was boringly simple. If a man does not respect his own father, how can he be trusted to respect his ruler? If a man is not kind to his own younger brother, how can he be kind to a stranger? Xiao meant more than just obeying your parents. It was a boring, complex web of obligations. It meant caring for them in their old age. It meant bringing honour, not shame, to the family name. And most boringly of all, it meant mourning them properly after they died. Confucius was a boring traditionalist who insisted on the ancient 3-year mourning period for a parent, a boring custom that his contemporaries found wildly impractical, just as he had done for his own mother. All of society, he argued, was just the family writ large. The government itself was just an extension of the family. The emperor was the parent of the people. This led him to his final, boring, and most famous organizing principle, the 5 basic relationships. This was his boring map for a perfectly harmonious society. He taught that all of human life could be understood through these 5 relationships, each with its own boring set of duties and obligations. 1. Ruler and subject. 2. Father and son. 3. Husband and wife. 4. Elder brother and younger brother. 5. Friend and friend. Notice a boring pattern? 4 of the 5 are hierarchical. This was not a philosophy of equality. Confucius looked at the chaos of his time and believed the solution was a boring, rigid social order. Everyone must know their place. But, and this is what made him so different from the legalists, these boring relationships were reciprocal. It wasn't just boring, one-way obedience. Each person owed something to the other. The subject owes the ruler loyalty, but the ruler owes the subject ren, benevolence, compassion, and moral leadership. A ruler must be virtuous and provide for good government. The son owes the father xiao, filial piety, but the father owes the son kindness and a proper education. The wife owes the husband obedience, but the husband owes the wife righteousness and care. The younger brother owes the elder brother respect, but the elder brother owes the younger brother gentleness and guidance. Only friend to friend was the relationship boringly equal, based on mutual trust and trustworthiness. This was his boring answer to the chaos. No harsh punishments, no boring withdrawal from the world, just a simple, boring, interlocking system of duties. If every single person, from the duke to the farmer, simply did their boring duty in their specific role, society would heal itself, harmony would be restored. And what was the goal of all this boring work? The goal of practicing Ren, the goal of mastering the Li, the goal of perfecting the 5 relationships. It was to become a Yunzi, Junzi. This is the last boring and crucial term. Junzi is often translated as gentleman or superior person. Before Confucius, Junzi was a boring term of birth. It literally meant son of a lord. You were a Yunzi if your father was a noble. It was a boring accident of aristocracy. Confucius, the poor boy from the fallen noble family, performed his most boring and most radical act. He redefined the word. For Confucius, a Junzi was not someone born noble. A Junzi was someone who became noble through boring, constant, lifelong self-cultivation, education, and the practice of Ren and Li. This was revolutionary. He was saying that the son of a duke who was a moral degenerate was not a gentleman, but a boring peasant boy, if he studied, practiced the rituals, and cultivated his Ren, could become a superior person. Virtue, he argued, was not a matter of birth. It was a matter of effort. The Yunzi, he taught, has morality as his basic stuff, and by observing the rites puts it into practice. The Junzi stands in awe of the mandate of heaven. The Junzi is reverent, respectful, and does nothing amiss. This was his boring, simple, and profoundly difficult answer to the chaos of his time. He didn't offer a new political system. He offered a boring instruction manual for how to be a good human being. These ideas, Ren, benevolence, Li, ritual, Xiao, piety, and the Yunzi, the superior person, were just whispers when Confucius died. They were the boring ramblings of a failed old teacher, preserved in a boring scrapbook by his students. The story of how these boring rules for daily life, these quiet conservative ideas, would one day be resurrected to conquer an entire civilization. That is perhaps the greatest and most boringly accidental legacy of all. This was his boring, simple, and profoundly difficult answer to the chaos of his time. He didn't offer a new political system. He offered a boring instruction manual for how to be a good human being. These ideas, Ren, benevolence, Li, ritual, Xiao, piety, and the Yunzi, the superior person, were just whispers when Confucius died. They were the boring ramblings of a failed old teacher, preserved in a boring scrapbook by his students. The story of how these boring rules for daily life, these quiet, conservative ideas, would one day be resurrected to conquer an entire civilization. That is perhaps the greatest and most boringly accidental legacy of all. When Confucius died in 479 BC, his philosophy was a failure. He had no political power, and his state of Lu was, like the rest of China, descending even further into the chaos that would become the Warring States period. His disciples scattered, each carrying their own boring notes and memories. They became teachers themselves, passing on the master's sayings. But they were just one small school among the 100 schools of thought. For the next 200 years, his ideas were not popular. The rulers of the Warring States period didn't want to hear about Ren, benevolence, or Li, ritual. They were engaged in a brutal, boring game of survival. They were interested in the philosophies that worked. They listened to the legalists who taught them how to build a strong, ruthless state through harsh punishments and absolute control. They listened to the military strategists like Sun Tzu, who taught them how to win wars through deception and efficiency. Confucianism, with its boring emphasis on virtue, morality, and looking to the past, seemed hopelessly naive and impractical. Then came the year 221 BC. The legalists won. The state of Qin, the most ruthless and anti-Confucian of all, conquered everyone. Its leader, Qin Shi Huang, became the first emperor of a unified China, and he hated Confucius. He saw Confucianism, with its boring focus on the past and its moral judgments on rulers, as a direct threat to his power. In 213 BC, he ordered the infamous burning of the books. His legalist advisors, especially Li Si, argued that these old philosophies confused the people and undermined the authority of the state. Copies of the Analects and other Confucian classics were hunted down and burned. Scholars who dared to discuss them in public were executed. It was a boring, systematic attempt to wipe Confucius's ideas from the face of the earth. It seemed, for a moment, that the legalists had succeeded. Confucius was truly, finally, dead. But the Qin dynasty, built on boring, brutal, legalist efficiency, was a boring failure. It was too harsh, too cruel. It collapsed in on itself just 15 years after it was founded. Out of the ashes, a new dynasty arose, the Han dynasty, founded in 206 BC. The Han emperors had a boring, practical problem. They had a vast new empire to run, but the legalist philosophy of the Qin was too brutal to win the people's loyalty. They needed a new state philosophy. They needed a boring, stable social glue. And so, these new emperors, looking for a system, boringly dusted off the old books that had been hidden in walls or memorized by scholars, and they found the teachings of the old failed philosopher from Lu, and they realized his boring ideas were the perfect tool for running an empire. Confucius's philosophy, with its boring emphasis on Li, ritual, Xiao, filial piety, and the 5 relationships, was the ultimate boring blueprint for social harmony. It taught the subject to be loyal to the ruler. It taught the son to be loyal to the father. It taught everyone to know their boring place in a rigid, stable hierarchy. It was, in short, the perfect philosophy for a boring bureaucracy. Under Emperor Wudi, who reigned in the 2nd century BC, Confucianism was officially adopted as the state philosophy. The boring Analects went from being a banned book to a required text, and the Han dynasty did something that would cement Kongqiu's legacy forever. They created the Imperial Civil Service examination system. This was a boring but revolutionary idea. To get a job in the government, to become a magistrate, a tax collector, or a minister, you couldn't just be a friend of the Duke. You couldn't just be a powerful general. You had to pass a boring, incredibly difficult multi-day examination. And what was on this test? Not military strategy, not legalist tricks. Confucius. For the next 2,000 years, with some interruptions, if you were an ambitious young man in China, your entire life was dedicated to one boring task: memorizing and writing essays about the Analects and the 5 classics that Confucius had edited. This system, this boring test, did something Kongqiu himself could never have dreamed of. It created an entire ruling class, a boring bureaucracy of yunzi, gentlemen, who were all by definition Confucian scholars. His ideas weren't just a philosophy, they were the government. This is the boring and accidental triumph of Confucius. He died a failure. He was persecuted and his books were burned. But because his boring ideas were so incredibly useful for creating a stable social order, they were adopted. They became the boring operating system of a civilization. His boring rules for how to be a good son became the boring foundation of law. His boring emphasis on Li and ritual became the boring basis for all social etiquette, diplomacy and art. His boring belief that a yunzi, gentleman, was made through education, not birth, became the boring engine of social mobility for millions. He didn't succeed in his lifetime. He succeeded, boringly, over the next 2 millennia, long after his death. And so, the man who was once a boring accountant in a granary, the boring failed politician who wandered for 13 years, the boring old teacher who died thinking he was a footnote, boringly, and accidentally became the single most influential teacher and philosopher in East Asian history. He wanted to restore the past, but instead he, boringly, created the future. Thank you for joining us on this long journey through the life, the world, and the boring but profound ideas of Kongqiu, the man we call Confucius. If you found this exploration relaxing, or perhaps even learned something interesting along the way, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to uncover these quiet corners of the past. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, and your dreams filled with the gentle echoes of history.